What if the key to restoring our oceans wasn't just conservation, but transformation, architected with precision, powered by data, and inspired by hope? And what if the blueprint for that transformation came from someone whose life has been shaped by division, resilience, and cultural exchange? Hey, everybody, I'm Stephen Schauer, and welcome to Stories Sustain Us, where we explore the lives of remarkable individuals working to create a more sustainable, just, and connected world for all. On today's episode, we begin a two-part journey with Fritz Neumeyer, an architect, strategist, and CEO who's helping design a future where our oceans are not only protected, but restored to abundance. In part one of this special conversation, Fritz shares his personal story, growing up in Berlin during the final years of the Cold War, navigating the cultural intersections of East and West, as influenced by some of his formative early teen years taking place in California. You'll hear how architecture runs in his blood, handed down from his father. And Fritz also shares about how his worldview was shaped by the exchange of cultural ideas between the Pacific coast of California and the divided and reunited Berlin of his youth, together with the echoes of the Soviet legacy. Given the history he personally witnessed, it's no wonder Fritz believes that understanding the past is essential for designing a better future. Here's a bit more about Fritz Neumeyer. Fritz is the co-founder and CEO of Oceans 2050, an ambitious initiative that aims to restore ocean abundance within a single generation. Professional architect with a deep interest in philosophy, science, and sport, Fritz holds a master's degree from ETH Zurich and brings a systems thinking approach to marine restoration. He applies the tools of architecture and digital innovation to build an ecosystem of action, creating first-of-their-kind tools and frameworks to enable meaningful impact in ocean health and restoration. It's worth mentioning before we dive into this episode, Fritz and I also speak a bit about his partner in marriage, who is also the co-founder and president of Oceans 2050, Alexandra Cousteau. Alexandra is the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, and she is carrying on the incredible legacy of her family. She's an award-winning advocate for ocean restoration and abundance, and Alexandra collaborates with world leaders across sectors to influence, convene, and mobilize action to achieve measurable outcomes. Together, as co-founders of Oceans 2050, Fritz and Alexandra are truly a power couple, advocating for a better future for all and taking actionable steps to return the world's oceans to abundance. Because this conversation was so insightful, I've split it into two parts. Today's episode is all about Fritz's personal journey, his upbringing, education, and the cross-cultural influences that shaped him. In part two, airing next week on June 3rd, we'll dive into the groundbreaking work he's doing at Oceans 2050 and what it will take to truly restore our oceans. From divided cities to unified visions, from personal legacy to planetary future, this is a story you won't want to miss. So let's begin here on Stories Sustain Us, where we are inspiring action through the power of storytelling. Fritz, welcome to Stories Sustain Us. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been looking forward to this conversation for many, many weeks now, so it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Took us a bit.
Yeah, no,
sorry about that. And
no,
yeah,
it's all good.
We had great conversations leading up to it, so that was
absolutely. I feel like I've gotten to know you actually a lot better than I've known some of my guests who I've just kind of met for the first time, here in the interview. So I appreciate the little up-leading conversations we've had to this point. So I'm over in Seattle. Tell everybody where you are so we can kind of get geographically located on the globe so folks know where we are.
Yeah, I'm in Western France, in sort of in a countryside, in a place called the Loire Valley, which is a postcardy kind of place. Outside of 20 minutes outside of a medium-sized city called Angers. So we're in a beautiful time of year, and I closed the door so we can't hear the frogs, but there's lots of great stuff.
Nice.
Right now I get to live in a postcard. So,
Nice. That's how I feel about the Pacific Northwest most days as well. So, well, I want to get to Oceans 2050, but first, you know how
yeah.
the format of the show, we get to know a little bit about you first. So, tell us about your life, Fritz. Where you didn't always live in a postcard. So,
I certainly didn't think I would end up in France. No.
right. So, what's
Yeah.
your story?
Yeah. So as we started with France, I can go to. So I'm actually sort of from the European counterpart. I'm German. I'm from Berlin.
Yeah.
And then I can start with the end of that story. Then I married, somewhat surprisingly, and my wife's half French and half American. We'll get to her later.
Yeah.
And so now I ended up here. So yeah, I'm talking about frogs. I'm also a big city guy. Right, I'm from Berlin. It's a kind of unique place to grow up in back in the 80s and 90s. So very interesting history and like very, very interesting period to grow up in that you don't really know when you grow up there. But afterwards, looking back, it's kind of a very peculiar little period.
Huge time. Yeah.
Yeah, and then big city guy. Sort of a lot of those standard things. Love sports, music, clubbing.
Yeah.
The regular big city stuff. And I probably, like early mentioned here, lived in the U.S. as a kid.
Yeah.
Had my 2 years in California, in middle school in Los Angeles, Santa Monica by the beach, all that stuff. So I got a good chunk of sort of early childhood Americanizing.
Yeah.
And
so how did that happen? How did you get? What was, I guess, because you would have come with your parents, I'm assuming. So what was? How did that happen? You got from Berlin to Los Angeles. That's a pretty big jump in the 80s, I'm imagining.
Absolutely. So I get to tie two threads here. So I'm an architect, but I also come from an architect family. Like my father's a professor for architectural theory. And in the 80s, he published his first book that was kind of had a big splash in his field. And back then, I don't know if they still have it, but so the Getty Center was still in Santa Monica, not in that fancy place that they built afterwards.
Yeah.
And they had they had to, I think the numbers I remember from my childhood is that they had to spend $83 million a year in order not to pay taxes on them. So they built all these beautiful programs. And so they just gave out scholarships for certain things and invited my father after he wrote the book. So we got like this cute little apartment on 3rd Street.
Nice. At
the Getty Center with lots of other people from all over the world. I remember literally last week I got in contact with there was a guy, a kid my age across the hallway, Conrad Shawcross, who's, I think they were there because of his mother who'd written something, but his father was this crazy great lord somewhere, and then his mother's new boyfriend was this funky English artist with an amazing accent who would constantly smoke dope. It was just anyway. It was this really great thing, and so the other thing that they
lively
did was,
place.
It's fantastic. So they had these 2 houses in 3rd Street, full of these scholarship people, and they would organize all this great stuff. So we constantly going on these group cultural things. So it was basically you got a small stipend, an apartment, and at that point for my father, the important thing was you got access to the Getty Library, which is a really unique thing. And my father sort of the world's premier scholar on Mies van der Rohe, very famous sort of historic architect. And they have all his old library stuff. So he got to go.
So that was for him. That was in heaven there. Yeah,
it was a match made in heaven for everyone. And all he had to do was research and write and just sort of say thank you to the Getty Center. When you published, it went so well that instead of a year, we stayed almost 2.
Nice.
And so I had my 2 years in California middle school. Lived 3 streets away from the ocean, and boogie boarding and baseballs and all that kind of stuff. So.
Definitely a Southern California upbringing there for a little bit. That's imagine a big change from what would have been West Berlin at the time. So
yeah, sure, absolutely, and like on many different levels, and really just really fortunate. I gotta say this. So first thing, my wife's very clear about this. If she's adamant that we wouldn't be married if I had a thick German accent. That's the first thing. So and then just culturally, I mean, I think in general, there's a huge shift as a kid if you go from a 1-language mind to a 2-language mind. I think that's sort of, there's either mono or multi. So that's a big shift culturally. Obviously, it was awesome as a young kid to live away at the beach, and then California was a great place to be. The other thing that was great is when I came back, we still had, loads of American forces, sort of
Yeah.
short
Interesting
blueprint.
time and
Berlin was
period.
divided in four after the war, right? Russians, French, Brits, and Americans. And the Americans stayed the longest. And so we had all this cool stuff in the South. Like we had, PX shops and sports stuff. And so after that, I kind of got connected to the American community in Berlin.
Yeah.
Got access to the PX store. And so that was really fun. We had AFN, American Forces Network. So I kind of kept in touch with, I had like the Fresh Prince, right? So I kind of kept up with regular vocabulary and all that kind of stuff, and American TV shows. Funny how that matters, right?
It does matter. But I appreciate the cultural connection, because that was a giant show at the time, and seeing that was mattering, made sense to you and connected with you over in West Berlin at the time. That's beautiful.
Connected. So the other thing that happened was like so I was in the US in the late 80s, but in the 90s, American culture like took a real foothold in Europe, right? Hip hop came. Those shows, like fresh was a word we used in Germany as an adjective, and it came out of this kind of stuff, right? And like words like dope. And then hip hop changed everything, right? So we
big
all
influence.
We had the early like breakdancing, graffiti parties, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. Really, like that's why Berlin's still famous for our clubbing and party culture, and it came out of that push. But then also, I was on the first, like, sort of one of the early German kids to play on the Berlin baseball team. Basically, I was a shortstop because I knew the rules. So kind of just like, and then I ended up playing basketball in my life, like passionately, and it's all kind of from that stuff. And then there's something else. Oh yeah, so my father ended up teaching like SciArc, and then at Princeton and Harvard, and the coolest thing ever that I had was, I think he was teaching at Princeton when I was in my teens. And so we there for a couple of months, just visiting, because we didn't move over. And so I had a Princeton campus ID. And that was like the magic thing when I came back to Berlin. Because, some of these parties, the American stuff would be American ID only, or access to the PX store. And I would just come in with my I don't have an American, I have a Princeton ID. And I was
that was good enough.
That was amazing.
And
then my teens were like dominated by sort of American cultural influence. And then, there was other stuff too, like the Wonder Years, right? Like I'll never forget the Cosby Show, like we got all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, let's to finish this period. So the other thing I had is funny story too. In school, I went to like my first foreign language was Latin. Right? So Latin, then to English in 7th grade, which is obviously convenient for me because when we started having English in class, I'd just gotten back from the US. But my last 2 years of school, I obviously took like English sort of as a sort of special kind of reinforcement. And my English teacher was this amazing guy, Mr. Eif, gorgeous daughter too. But he'd married a gorgeous daughter because he'd married this very successful and gorgeous businesswoman who was German. Yeah. And he'd followed her to Berlin. And he had taught.
So he was U.S. He was American.
He was American.
Okay. Yeah.
And so he was like my absolute, because he had taught American literature at Cornell and Ithaca.
Oh, right? Just a little thing. Yeah.
And he'd coached basketball, right? So and then so he came to Berlin because of his awesome wife, and she was the big breadwinner with business, and so he just like got bored. And so he's like, well, what's the best high school I can find here that's sort of on the western part? And so he ended up teaching English at my high school for the last 2 years.
Wow.
But we have a year extra, so it's 12th and 13th grade. But he was obviously like completely overqualified, right? But so, and that's why I learned proper adult English. So in 2 years, I think he ran us like through 4 feet of classics of American literature and like,
nice,
the full program. And I got to sit in his classroom. I'll never forget this. My most poignant school memories are, so in his classroom, he had 2 posters, like the iconic posters, these 2 Nike Just Do It posters.
Yeah.
One of them is Michael Jordan with the dunk contest where he's sort of flying in the air.
Just flying through the air, yeah.
And then the other one's Jerry Rice from the back holding up the ball with like one of those 49ers touchdowns.
Yeah.
And he coached our basketball team. So that was kind of my more mature version And
That's
because before that,
wonderful. Yeah.
my English was TV shows in eighth grade, and I'm
Pop
feel.
culture.
Yeah, and the other thing about growing up in California, which is the tough thing with my kids, my wife sometimes gets a little piffy about this, is that when you're in sixth and seventh grade in California, like every third word is either like the F word or some other swear thing. It's not
Sure.
very,
Yeah, that's how it
very,
was in South Texas too, where I grew up. So
not very polished. So I sometimes I actually literally have to do this in business relationships where I sometimes have to say, hey, when I get really excited and my English roots come out, I might not have the right sense for what's appropriate or not.
yeah,
Luckily, most people are comfortable with swear words.
yeah. F-bombs are pretty normalized these days.
Yeah, good for me.
Yeah, good for me too.
They come out when I get excited.
Likewise.
Yeah, interesting. That was a little discourse excursion here. No,
yeah.
So that's sort of, I think that's why I'm married, and actually it stayed. So right, so I remember sort of through university as an architect, you spend a lot of time in front of a screen, right?
Yeah.
Like open design rooms, and I would just always have headphones on and have like all the American comedians on, like the potty mouth comedian as well. So like that got me through university. So
yeah.
And then I still remember my first date with my wife. Like we were set up on a blind date, but the first thing we talked about was the Daily Show and Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart, yeah.
That was sort of back in the 2000 whatever, when that was a sort of live, and she was like,
deal.
"Oh, this is interesting. Here's this German guy, but he knows Jon Stewart, so maybe this isn't so bad. And he doesn't have an accent." Yeah. So just as we're speaking here, where you started with geography, is I do have, like, I'm German, but I have a really heavy sort of early Americanized.
Yeah, clearly you were kind of in that integration into U.S. culture and language and everything seems very clear as part of your upbringing. Did you always know you were? Oh, go ahead. I have another kind of transition question, but before we leave that conversation, what was your last thought?
Yeah, no, it's interesting now. We've talked about it, right? Where in this period specifically, which is very, unique in the historic context of like the last 60, 70 years, right? So
yeah.
And now we're seeing sort of America leading a period of change with all sorts of, very sort of changey, disruptive dynamics.
Yeah.
But on the opposite, we're just talking about American culture. Like, for my father, them and their generations, like the Americans are still like, they're the saviors, right? Those are the guys that came in and kind of rescued everyone from, my country did a little bit of damage.
A little bit of history there. Yeah.
So,
I was in South Korea a few years ago, and I'm not military, but just older generation of South Koreans just walking on the street of Seoul were kind of like, acknowledging as you walked by. I'm assuming they were assuming I was U.S. military, but I think that connection to some older generations of the United States of, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 40s, that changing world that was happening at that point in the 20th century, still reverberates for some of those older generations, which is nice on some levels, because we are undergoing some change that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But let me ask you that transition question about change in your life before we catch up to kind of present day change. Did you always know you were going to go into architecture, because it was a kind of, that's what your father was doing? Or, when you left to go on to university and start your own studies and growing into adulthood, did you already know that, or was there a story there about how you kind of came to that?
Yeah, actually there is, I guess. So you could kind of say it's by osmosis.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
you're around it so much. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in a really cool kind of way, like from the classics to, the most time my father spent with me, we were either drawing, like coming up with stuff, Legos, building things, and then just other stuff like deeply cultural. As Europeans do, we traveled a lot, right?
Yeah.
And in Europe, things are a lot closer. So if you're on the road for a couple of hours or in a plane for a couple of hours, you're in very different cultures. And so we would spend. I remember in my childhood, we'd be in Greece like multiple times a year. We'd be
Nice.
down in Italy. So, but when we did, the interesting thing about my family context there, my father specifically, my mother is an architect too. She was a smaller scale, practicing architect. Other people were lying at the beach. I was running around in temple ruins, right, in Paestum and in Greece, and the Acropolis is one of my earliest memories.
Nice.
And so, and then when I was a teenager, I basically had my own lecture series wherever we were going, like through Florence. It's funny, like, when I was in Florence with the family for the first time last year, I'm walking through these things, and all of a sudden, like, I can feel this disc coming into my head, and I've got like these lectures that I would just soak in from my father. Like, I'm coming and I'm telling to my kids. It was kind of really sweet, sort of generational moment of how those kind of things work.
Yeah.
And then, I guess, we talked about the Getty Center. I've just always been around it. And then, so starting with that, actually, I was, I talked about like the way that they would do things with us and put these groups together. And so I'm an only child as well. So my parents took me everywhere, right, from the earliest days. And then I would, the thing, like when your father's a professor and then it's sort of on that Princeton kind of Ivy League kind of level, I was just always sitting at the dinner table with the most important names in, I was friends with still friends with the son of Frank Gehry, and I ended up playing in their house after school every day because it's right around the corner, and I was like a good buddy. And it's just, I grew up with it. Right?
Yeah.
So actually, you asked, I didn't always know, but it is sort of, architecture is that kind of discipline where lots of stuff comes together. And I was always I like doing lots of stuff. So I grew up with this kind of complexity and a lot of the stuff that interested me. And I do remember, like, I showed my kids the other day, my high school yearbook, where other people write stuff about you. It wasn't all complimentary, but one of the things that was in there was like, I'd like to do something between architecture and philosophy. So like that was
kind of that seed was there. Yeah.
My generation still had this lucky thing called, lucky thing, but sort of in this context, lucky thing called military service, right? So finished high school
in West Germany,
I think it was the last year in Berlin, and you got a year to think about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
it was
by the
compulsory.
time I was
you had to do it, right? It was.
Yeah. That was the last year that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Last year I had to do it.
Were you in Berlin when communism, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall came down?
Were
you there?
I mean, I was.
What an incredible, wild, emotional time that must have been. At least that's what it seemed like from the news and newspapers and reading about it and watching about it. From my high school in San Antonio, it was incredible. But I don't know. What was it like? Obviously, living in it.
So that's the funny thing, right? It's emotional now when I look at historic footage. Back then, we were what? This was in '89 when the wall came down. I was barely 12, and I remember there was this thing. Yeah, the wall's coming down. So and our school was sort of not far from it, so we like had a day off and went over. But we were just in it. We for us, and it like West Berlin. I mean, historic kind of rarity, but it was this little island, right, in Eastern Berlin.
Right.
We'd always grown up with this strange stuff. If we wanted to drive to my grandparents, we would have to pass the border twice, like into East Germany and out of it, and the highway would be in this weird tunnel thing. It's basically an extension of a wall. So for us, it was just this always oddity.
Yeah.
And then, if we really for us, it was more like an in the thing experience.
Yeah.
Then, it took a while, and I think so. The wall came down in '89, and we all started driving at like mid '90s, and that's when it got interesting because old place, old Russian military camps that we would go on these discovery trips, and then sort of the famous legendary Berlin party scene of the '90s was all of this stuff in all these unused places, and the wall went right through the center of the city. Right, that's what they've been rebuilding over the last 20 years to kind of stitch that stuff together with all that prime real estate. But there was just all of the stuff that you see in the films. That's kind of the thing that the Berlin of the '80s, pre and post and Cold War times, had that strange singular flair to it.
Yeah.
And for us, it was kind of our playground. Actually, the first experiences were when they put the sports leagues together. Right, so I was playing basketball and field hockey at the time, and all of a sudden,
You're integrating with East
all of a sudden
Germans
you're on a train for an hour driving out to this place that feels like it was literally a different world.
Yeah.
So East Berlin on the outside specifically, especially in the early years, it was, so I mean, just like so the socialism, communism part of it, those satellite parts of the town, there's literally no physical difference between an away game sort of in far East Berlin than if you got out of the train and got out the outskirts of like, I mean, I've never been to Moscow, but you see or like Prague or Warsaw or whatever it is, those Eastern, they're all, it's all the same, down to like how the chemical products smell. And like, so I still have all these funky, visceral memories. But it was more, for us, it was more like a playground thing. And man, was it strange. Like culturally, the difference is just...
Sure, I can only imagine.
It was really like when you went to those parts of towns, it was a kind of, and I'm not going to call it an out of body, but it was a very different experience.
Yeah. Well, I'd imagine reverse for the, folks who grew up in the East under the, Soviet bloc, that it was a mind-blowing experience to visit to the, West and see what they had access to that they didn't have access to in the East. So I'm sure going both directions, it was just a out-of-body experience and just
absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
And it still shows, right? We can finish this off here with like, we just had our elections, and so we've, for the first time in history, we've got what we call like the far right on the rise.
Yeah.
And when you look at the voting map of Germany, it's literally color coded, like the former Eastern states. We've got 5 states, 11 old ones. They're a sort of a different color code to everything else.
Yeah.
And people try to make a point of that, but it's interesting when you see the underlying economic maps, they're the same. Education levels, employment levels, wage levels, like all this kind of stuff that you would...
Yeah, the ripples of the old Soviet Union are still...
Yeah, it's still being seen. Ages.
Yeah,
it's really going to take ages to
wow.
multiple generations to
rebalance.
So back, like, let's tie that knot to the front, because that was the big difference, right? So the West, behind the leadership of the U.S., decided that Western Germany needed to be built up. While the Russians just kept sort of draining.
Took everything they could. Yeah.
Well, some sort of a hybrid, but they it was more taking than giving.
Right.
And that's what made that discrepancy so great.
Right. Well, let's continue on your journey to the early 2000s. Then I guess you're an architect. You're in the U.S., and you mentioned earlier this is around the time you met a young woman who probably was influential in your life.
Yeah, so it was actually a little later.
Okay.
So I wouldn't call myself, wasn't young. So I was an architect. No, so the only time I lived in the U.S. was in the 80s. I mean, I kept my connections. I kept coming back. I had some friendships, and then obviously for us, like the U.S. would be a destination. And friends of mine moved over and did their part. Like actually, one of my best childhood friends from Berlin spent his sort of high school year over in Santa Monica. So I go visit him and hang out with he went to the high school where all the people went that I was in junior high school with. So those connections I kept. But I studied, I finished my architecture studies in Zurich.
Okay, yeah.
MTH down there. And then I went back to Berlin to work, and then founded an office with my first partner. And then in my, 2009. So this was early 30s. I met my wife.
Okay.
And then things changed.
Yeah.
changed a lot. So, so my wife's comes from a really, really famous ocean family, right? So her grandfather is sort of a household name for, I mean, not necessarily our generations, but the ones before, Jacques Cousteau.
Household name in my generation, from my home. My father was a scuba diver, so we had, ocean books that, I learned who Jacques Cousteau was when I was a teenager because of, my father's interest in scuba diving. So,
well, I'll be honest, I didn't fully, I mean, I kind of a vague idea, but I still just, when vague idea. So
Yeah.
I do remember my father told me we used to watch those when I was really young.
Yeah.
He also said, I mean, this is something you often hear actually from sort of the one generation behind ours, is that he would go with his father to go watch those things every Sunday.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
That's something that I've heard a lot. One of the really funny things, or not funny, but really interesting things about being married to my wife is I didn't really know what I was getting into from that perspective, but
Sure.
that family just meant a lot to people in that generation. I mean, and there's simple facts around it too. We can get this out of the way really quickly. I mean, I remember seeing this was really fun, interesting. In the 70s, Jacques Cousteau was the second most known or / famous person in the world, right? And in the world is always this interesting. It's actually like a parlor dinner game I play with people.
Yeah.
And who was number one, right? And then people go through the Pope and whatever musicians, and that's always this Western view. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, Muhammad Ali or Pele is my guess.
No, it's Muhammad Ali, right? That's the thing, right? Because even Pele is soccer, and there's a whole part of the world that doesn't care about soccer. The one thing everybody cares about is, fighting. Yeah. So it's actually Muhammad Ali. Yeah. But so her grandfather's number 2 in the world, right? And so we're talking about Eastern. Like one of my best friends I grew up with is Russian. And I still remember the first time he told his father, who I was marrying, his father lost his shit because they were watching this stuff in the 2000s just because they didn't have this,
catching up, sure,
different, less television programming.
Yeah.
And her father, so there's Jacques, and then my wife Alexandra's father is Philippe, who the one who did all the cool stuff with the big guy.
Yeah.
He was number 7. Right. Wow. So it's that's so, I didn't really know. I looked it up a bit and was like, what's this?
Yeah.
And then my friends didn't either. So I think it's kind of a generational thing. But then again, with people who have connections to the oceans, it's a really big, he's the iconic guy with the red hat. And, interestingly, a lot of people think he's a marine biologist. He's very much not. This guy's like an inventor and an explorer and the first guy to film. But he literally, the regulator, if you do scuba, the thing you breathe through, that's still the invention.
Yeah, that's how I learned of him, is kind of through my father saying, this is the guy that kind of invented all this stuff that I get to go do on the weekends. So
it was meant to be a car part, by the way, right?
Oh, really? How things change.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll say this honestly too. I've only recently caught up on the details. I mean, obviously, I've kind of I've lived a lot through this, and not only in the nicest ways, So just to finish the history here, so Philippe was the guy who did all the stuff, the filming and the storytelling with his father, and he had this, the 2 famous vessels are the Calypso, the boat, and then there was Philippe, who had this flying Calypso. It was a boat and flying like an what do you call it? Airplanes that can land on water, in the same coloring, and he's also the one who changed the narrative quite a bit. So Jacques Cousteau is sort of this Navy officer out of the Second World War, escaped death a couple of times, but this is sort of that badass generation, and had that sort of the explorer's drive.
Explorer's part, sure.
Let's say. So, and then he's the one who brings the oceans to the world, but I think one of the real reasons why he's sort of such a magical person for everyone is because he's actually not a marine biologist. He's a storyteller, right? Yeah. He often says this. He's like, I'm not a scientist. I'm a cinematographer. That's what he actually is. He's like this magical storytelling person. Going back to what we talked about in the pre-run here. It's like
the power of storytelling. Yeah,
exactly, and that's how humans do history, and that's the stuff how we gel together and stuff. There's actually really funny lines. There's a great documentary on National Geographic called "Becoming Cousteau." I think it's even on Disney, and there's a cute biopic called "Odyssey" and stuff. So in the recent years there've been some movies that actually got me up to date on some of the details, because the tragic part is that my wife's father, Philippe, died in a plane crash with his flying Calypso when she was 4 or something. So he died early, but he'd been the one who'd kind of introduced what now is the Cousteau legacy, more than the exploration, which is this. He was kind of one of the driving force behind the Cousteau Society being founded, and this whole thing becoming something that isn't, dirty little secret. It's in all the movies, so I can talk about it. The early expeditions of the Calypso were founded by oil, right?
Sure.
Diving, but they
had to get revenue somewhere, right? Somebody had to pay for it.
Yeah, a lot of the Middle East is sort of based on the stuff they found in the ocean, right? So,
right.
And then that changes when they found founded, is that the word?
Yeah, founded. Yeah.
Founded the Cousteau Society, and the whole thing becomes a nonprofit, and it becomes like a natural sort of an ocean advocacy.
Yes, conservation ethos.
Brand, right? Yeah, and so Philippe literally co-founded that whole idea of conservation and the conservation ethic, and this idea that nature has an inherent value, right? And they have this, after his death, this the Antarctica thing, they're saying that moratorium, like all that stuff comes out of that part. But I wasn't familiar with any of that, so I caught up on that stuff. Those movies actually really helped.
Nice. So let's.
So I marry into that, not really.
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot that happens between the meeting, the marriage, and in the ensuing years. But let's maybe take a jump in time and talk about to where we are now in the formation of Oceans 2050 that you're co-founder of with your wife Alexandra Cousteau. And so can you talk about the formation of the organization? It's a great story that you told me one time off camera. I'd love to kind of get it on camera here, because it was such a moving story about how you guys came to create this organization.
Yeah, sure. So met my wife. That did change my trajectory, right? So that's why I talk about my former partner, because all of a sudden I'm like, oops. So I was in Berlin when I met her. She was in Washington, and then things went kind of quickly, right? Just in your early 30s, when you know. So I moved over. We lived in Washington for a while. We got married there, had our daughter really quickly, and moved back to Berlin. And so for a number of years, I'm still practicing as an architect, and I'm, kind of proudly playing this role of a supportive husband. It's like, look, my wife, she does all this cool stuff here in marriage, ocean advocate, whatever. Yeah. Not a bad look. So you want to just represent. And, and I help where I could, sort of on a thinking perspective and stuff, but she was running her own thing. When I met her, she did this really cool, like she was on an expedition tour on John McCain's old, what's that thing? The Something Express?
When he was campaigning, what was it?
Something Express, his bus.
It's just, I want to say it's like the Hard Truth Express or something, but that's not quite it.
Yeah, but something close.
Yeah.
I gotta look at it later. So they literally had that bus where they rebranded it, and then they had their, it was called Expedition Blue Planet. So they'd done a global version of that sort of storytelling around water, very broadly, ocean, water, all sorts of different things. And they'd done that. It was well received. She became like a National Geographic explorer and a young global leader and all this kind of stuff. And it's funny because she did that on a global. They went in India and the Middle East, but they did an American part as well. And then the American sponsors were like, "Wow, this is great. So happy we don't have these issues." Right? And they're like, "Are we sure about that?" And so 2010 they did this expedition through Canada and North America on this bus, Straight Talk Express.
Express. That's what it was.
John McCain. Even the same driver, but we branded that. And so I met her. She was on that. She was on the road for like 3.5 months. I don't know how many thousands of miles. This absolutely crazy schedule. I would kind of fly in and meet them somewhere and be like the intern that holds the sunscreen and gets everyone coffee. But then we moved back to Berlin because of my work and living conditions and other private stuff. And then, so what I would watch her over the years, just sort of get more and more, like, I could kind of see the lights dimming in the back. Yeah. She would come back, and you could kind of feel how she like, I mean, I'm not going to be too strong here, but losing hope. You could see it going down, sort of, and
Sure.
getting more like, we're losing this kind of thing here. And then that got exacerbated by our daughter, right? Sort of this. I mean, if you have kids, you know that, like, when you do, there's this interesting moment in life that happens where your perspective shifts from where your own life is not only about your own life anymore, but all of a sudden this generational perspective, and you spent most of your life's energy building up the future of these kids.
Yeah.
And for Alexandra specifically, she had this bitter thing where she came home one day and she's like, man, is it going to be like, our daughter's job as the fourth generation of the Cousteaus to write the obituary for the oceans? It's like, that's what. And so I was like, that sounds ugly.
Yeah, that's harsh. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was watching that until one day in 2019, she came back from an event where she'd been with Carlos. Carlos is Professor Carlos Duarte.
Yeah.
He's also our chief scientist, and I think we can say this now. He's like officially the most decorated marine scientist of our time. He just won the Japan Prize, which, as I understand, so for marine biology, it's the kind of the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, and he's the most published and all this kind of stuff. Whatever. So great guy. But she was with him at an event, and she the way she came back with it was like, hey, I just asked him, Carlos, are we done here, right? Are we just sort of going through the motions in a game that we know we're going to lose?
Yeah.
And so the great thing about Carlos is that he's got this unshakable science-based optimism, right?
Yeah.
Which makes it credible, right?
Yeah.
It's not hypeware. You always get this package of vision and scientific underbelly of it, right? It's a great 1-2 punch. And she's like, he's like, no, it's the opposite. No, it's not the opposite. He's like, can we still turn this around? He's like, yeah. The other thing you always hear from Carlos is I'm writing a paper about it. And so he was in the midst of that was my nickname for him for a while.
Yeah.
Publishing a paper about it. And so he published this. They were in the midst of this big paper called Rebuilding Marine Life, which ended up being published in 2020, I think, in early 2020. It was this big thing they'd worked on for years. But it is sort of the name's the game. It's Rebuilding Marine Life, and it's the scientific blueprint for how we can not only conserve the little that's left, right? That's the one thing Alexandra often talks about, sort of conservation and protection isn't interesting when you've lost half of what's going on, right? This is from her perspective. And so in this paper, he and his colleagues laid out this whole plan for how we can rebuild abundant oceans, not just sort of conserve a little, but get back to historical abundance, or whatever we think that is, within one human generation, right? And so it's got recovery wedges, it's got KPIs, so it's this very very broad visionary approach. Or not visionary, but a very aspirational approach, but it's underpinned with science and stories. There are all these great sort of reference markers. We got the whales back. That was one of the big things of Save the Whales in the 70s. Like that worked. And then there are these other stories about, you mentioned Korea, right? Like Vietnam, Delta restoration, like some of those war scars, like really successful ecosystem restoration reference projects. And this other one that's a little cynical, which is the nuclear testing they did in the
atolls,
deep Southwest Pacific or whatever it is.
Atolls, right? Bikini atolls and things like that. Yeah,
they basically blew them to pieces and then didn't come back for 30 or 40 years. And when they did, they found that sort of natural life was doing better in those areas where humans had not been for 40 years than in the adjacent ones. So it turns out it's better to blow a nuke and not have humans come for 40 years than it is to have humans around, which is, again, it's cynical. It's not true.
It is. Yeah. Let's avoid the nuclear part, blow up part. But yeah.
But the other thing about humans too, right? So
figure out how we can get to that part. Yeah.
Because there's this I'm just quoting Carlos here. And this is important not to fall into this narrative that humans are the bad guys, right? So, because in code we saw the opposite. In code we had this really interesting parallel of places that flourished because humans weren't, pushing on them, and others that didn't because the human stewardship was missing.
Humans weren't there to continue absolutely, and we're part of the system, right? We're not the bad guys or the good guys. We're just part of the system. We've overused the system in many places, but we're still part of it. So we have a role to play in the restoration of it.
Exactly. Right. So this is, I just want to make sure we don't fall into this.
Absolutely. And I love that story going from the deep-seated, worry and concern and probably fear of your daughter and her generation being the ones to write the obituary for the oceans to this is the generation that can see the oceans come back to life and come back to abundance. I mean, what a shift of perspective from the darkest of thoughts to the brightest of hopeful thoughts. We got a lot of work to do. But it sounds like that's why you guys formed your organization, is to get people doing that work.
You just nailed it there. So for me, that was that interesting, that was sort of the most contrast in it, to go from obituary. And so I literally saw the lights change, right? She comes back from this event and like the spark's back on, right?
Yeah.
This is exciting. And it was the same for me, right? Because literally like those two words, abundant, restoring abundance, right? Like, right, that sounds interesting. It sounds much more interesting than the old narrative of protect and conserve.
Conserving what's left, right.
Yeah, so there was a cynical one-liner that I used to throw around in our early years, which was sort of the best day in conservation is one where you don't lose, right? And that's just, that's difficult to sell as an exciting proposition.
Right? Yeah, it is.
Kind of like hey, honey, we only lost a little bit this week. It's really... And the moment you take that and you say, hey, we're going to be restoring abundance here, we're going to rebuild something, we know where we're going, and we've got this goal for, like, all of that energy flips. Yeah. And that's where I got a lot more...
Yeah, you get that creative energy going, right.
Interested. And then we talk a lot about history here. Like, as a German, we know, like, the potential of, like, how much collective energy rebuilding can unleash, right? Or we don't even have to make it about rebuilding, just like building a future together that's more interesting. Maybe that's the topic we can use to kind of take for later.
Yeah, go forward. Sure.
We as Germans know, how much that can work.
Yeah.
Right? And then same thing, like we're checking a lot of my boxes here. We go from protect and conserve to where I was always like, I can't sell this idea to my guys. It's not exciting. I can't even sell it to myself. To, hey, here's the stuff we get to rebuild something, and restoring abundance is aspirational. That's fun to work for, right? We can all, I can get a lot more people out of bed to do that than the other proposition. And so, that's when we founded Oceans 2050. And I got really involved sort of from the early days here because of that narrative change.
That wraps up part 1 of our incredible conversation with Fritz Neumeyer. I hope you found his journey as fascinating and thought-provoking as I did. But trust me, this story isn't over yet. Join us next week for episode 45 of Stories Sustain Us, where we continue our conversation with Fritz and dive deep into his groundbreaking work with Oceans 2050. It's a powerful discussion about shifting the narrative from ocean conservation to full-scale restoration, and how we can actually rebuild ocean abundance within a single generation. You won't want to miss it. Episode 45, part 2 of this amazing conversation, drops June 3rd. As always, it'll be available at storiessustainus.com, where you can watch on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcasts. And before we go today, if you've been inspired by today's episode, there are a few great ways you can support Stories Sustain Us. Subscribe to the show, leave a rating or review, share it with a friend, or visit us at storiessustainus.com to learn more. Following and sharing our social media content is also very helpful. I appreciate all your support. Thank you so much for being here today. Keep showing up, keep believing in the power of story, and keep doing your part to make the world a better place. Until next time, I'm Stephen Schauer. Please take care of yourself and each other. Take care.